Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and another video. Today I'm going to show you how I painted this realistic lion cub in watercolour and share a few tips and techniques I used as well, so I hope you enjoy the video. All the materials I've used will be listed in the description box below along with a reference photo from Pixabay. So I started out by transferring my outline sketch onto my watercolour paper and taping around the outside with frog tape to get a nice white border. I then used masking fluid around the cub's face and paws to make painting the background a lot quicker and easier. Once that was dry, I could then start painting the background, and for this I'm using a couple of new watercolours that I've bought fairly recently. The first is a Holbein watercolour in the shade yellow grey, and then I'm using the Daniel Smith buff titanium tube that I showed on a recent haul. I'm also going to be using a bit of Daniel Smith's Lunar Blue, which I'm putting onto my palette now. This is a granulating colour that came in a set of 6 different blues, and I'm really interested to see how it works on the background. I'm also going to add in a bit of burnt sienna. I'm aiming for a loose out of focus look for the background here, so I've pre-wet my paper and I'm just dropping in the paint onto the wet paper and letting them bleed together. The paper I'm using today is a 12 by 18 inch block of Fabriano Artistico 100% cotton cold press watercolour paper, which I tried a few weeks back when I painted a blue jay bird, and I wasn't too sure about it, so I'm going to give it another go today. For the area under the lion cub, I'm using Neutral Tint by Winsor & Newton, which I really like to use instead of black or any other dark colour like this, as it's a bit more interesting. Now this is a really large piece of paper, so I'm switching over to a wide flat brush. This is by Vinci and I think it's about 1 inch, as it really helps to cover a lot of paper quickly. So I pre-wet the paper with water, and I did several layers of water just to make sure that it really soaked in and to give me a bit more painting time. I then put in some of that neutral tint, and I'm using just quite loose strokes with my paintbrush. I don't want it to completely cover the bottom half of the drawing, but I don't want it to be too flat either. So I'm okay with having brush strokes and all that kind of thing, as I think it adds interest. Before my paper had completely dried, I then went over to a size 8 round brush just to add some really dark, intense colour underneath the lion cub. Masking around the cub's face really helped this part of the process, as I didn't have to paint painstakingly around each of those whiskers. To break up that block of colour, I also decided to use a damp brush just to lift out some of the pigment there. I decided to let that whole area dry completely before painting the ledge that the cub's resting on, so moved on to paint the eyes. For this I'm using the Holbein yellow grey colour that I used on part of the background, and I've switched down to a size 2 round brush. I'm just painting onto dry paper for the eyes and working them both at the same time. So I started off with a light layer of the yellow grey, and I'm also adding in, whilst that's still damp, a light layer of olive green yellow. That's from my Schminker set. Adding the darker colour under the eyelids helps to give the eye shadow, shape and form, and with the paint still wet it bleeds over the surface of the eye nicely and gives it a more realistic look. I'm adding some more olive green yellow here, just around the top part of the eye, leaving the pupil for now, and just outlining the bottom part of the iris. I like to build my layers up gradually when doing eyes so they really shine and look realistic. Here I'm again using that smaller brush to outline the eye using more neutral tint. I've left a really fine white line here to separate the iris from the eyelid to make sure the colours don't bleed together. When I paint the pupils in, I make sure the whole eye is dry, and then I can soften out any hard edges I don't want with a damp brush. And now I'm adding some more of that darker olive green yellow. I can go back in and add further layers once this is all dry, and I did add some masking fluid onto the eyes themselves just to add in those highlights and make them really bright, and I'll remove that later on. I used neutral tint to paint in the darkest part of the nose as well, and the mouth. And again, having that masking fluid really helped to define the area I needed to paint quite dark for the mouth here. For the detailed areas, I mainly use the wet on dry technique, so painting onto dry paper. But for the area around the nostrils here, I pre-wet it with water first before dropping in paint to get a softer look. I used dilute neutral tint for this, as well as a bit of the olive green yellow. So whilst that was all drying and the rest of the paper had completely dried, I could go back in and paint the wooden ledge that the cub's sitting on. Again, for this I used the wet in wet technique, so pre-wet my paper first before dropping in paint. Here I've switched up to a slightly larger size 8 round brush, and I'm dropping in all the colours that I've got on my palette to try and tie it all together. So I started off with some of Daniel Smith's Lunar Blue, which is in the little half pan you can see on the bottom of the screen, and then I added in some of the olive green yellow from my Schminker set, some of the yellow grey from Holbein, and some of the neutral tint as well. I used my reference photo as a guide here, but didn't copy it completely. But I did want to include the knot in the wood as I thought it added interest to the painting. And once that was done, I could then move on to the cub itself, and for this I used a base layer of the buff titanium. Whilst this was wet, I then dropped in some of Holbein yellow grey just to start indicating some of the shapes and clumps of fur here. Next, working left to right, I started on the first of the cub's ears, and again laid down a base layer of buff titanium before adding in any other colours. Daniel Smith's buff titanium is a low staining pigment. It's semi-transparent and does granulate, although when used watered down like I have for this first layer, you can't really see that. I do think though that I will use it a lot in my future animal paintings, as it's a really good base layer for all types of light or blonde fur or hair. If you haven't got it though, it doesn't matter, you can use something like a yellow ochre instead, as when I'm painting light fur or blonde hair, I do like to drop in a variety of different colours. So here I'm adding in some of the olive green yellow, some transparent ochre, the Holbein yellow green, and even some burnt sienna, but you can add in browns or even blues to blonde hair, which will really bring it to life. It's a really good idea to study your reference photo to see what hues and colours you can see, as it will depend on what's around the subject that you're painting and where the light's falling to. So I painted the other ear in much the same way, only going slightly darker on the inside of the ear there, just because it was more in shadow. Whilst this first layer on the ears was drying, I then went and filled in the first layer on the cub's back. I used more of the buff titanium and applied it onto dry paper with my size 8 brush, and then whilst this was still damp, I dropped in some darker shadow areas on the right hand side. For that colour I mixed up some neutral tint with some of the olive green. I also started to indicate where some of the darker hairs were on the top of the cub's head and back. Then moving on to the cub's face, and again I put down some of the buff titanium, and whilst this was wet, dropped in some of the other colours that I got on my palette. So I applied some neutral tint to the top of his head, and then used the buff titanium all over the face before dropping in some darker yellow grey and some olive green yellow. I tried to apply this first layer quite quickly and loosely because I knew I wanted to go back in and do more details later. So at this stage I'm just mapping out clumps of fur that I can see from my reference photo, which will simplify the whole process and make adding details in later a lot easier. I work on the cub's paw in the same way, so laying down a base layer of buff titanium and then dropping in some darker colours to the areas that are in shadow. Having used masking fluid at the start made this part a lot easier, as I didn't have to worry about painting around the whiskers when filling in the different shadows under the cub's head. I started to mark out some darker areas on the cub's paw using the Holbein yellow grey, but I'm still not putting in individual hair details yet. I also use a light wash of this same colour just to start indicating where some of the markings are on the cub's fur. Next, with the paper on the face dry, I start to build some depth by adding in some darker fur. I masked out the really light fur under the cub's eyes so I could do this quite quickly. I also use masking fluid to preserve some lighter fur detail on the insides of the cub's ears, which meant I could go in with my darker colours, like my burnt umber here, without worrying about them getting lost or painted over. This enabled me to really look at the different hues that I could see from my reference photo, and I could add in browns, golds and some of the olive green yellow to really add variety and interest. I also added in some more of the neutral tint to add depth into the inside of the ears, as well as in a more diluted form to add form and shape to the rest of the face. I applied these light washes onto the dry paper and then just softened out any hard edges using a clean damp brush. Before I could go any further with this painting though, I needed to remove that masking fluid and kind of smooth out any of the hard edges that have been left. And the good thing about this paper is that you can lift paint off it quite easily. So I just needed to go in with my damp brush and just slightly agitate the edges of my paint so that I could blend it out so it looks seamless. With that done, I could then start to work on the cub's chin, and for this I used the same method as for the rest of the fur. So I applied the buff titanium onto dry paper using a smaller round brush, and then I could drop in some of the Holbein yellow grey. I also used some of the olive green yellow as well as a bit of the burnt sienna. I used the same mixture of colours to intensify and darken up the area under the cub's nose too. Then it was back to my larger size 8 brush, which I dampened with clean water and used just to soften out some of the harsh edges that had been created with the masking fluid. With hindsight, I probably should have removed the masking fluid earlier, but we live and learn and it didn't prove too much of a problem. So for the rest of the painting, I decided to take a step back and look at it as a whole rather than just separate areas. I also took another look at my reference photo and had a look at the different values, the light, the shading and the details to see where I needed to improve in my painting. So I decided that I'd add some more glazes to try and bring this painting more to life and give it a bit more depth and contrast. This helps it look realistic, and sometimes it's quite easy to get stuck into the details when you're working on a small area, but it's important to take a step back and see what your painting needs as a whole. And that doesn't mean you have to copy your reference photo exactly. You may want to use a slightly different colour palette or a looser style of background like I have with this one, but it can really help with getting the right values, so how light and dark your colours are. Make sure your darks are dark enough and your lights are light enough, and that will really help your painting pop, whatever colours you're using. Once I'm happy with my values, I can then go in and add a few more details, like the dark fur markings on the cub's face and the fine hairs on his head and back. For this, I'm using a small and really old size 6 flat shader brush. I use this fairly dry, so hardly any water on it, and lightly brush in some of the fine dark hairs using a short flicking motion in the direction of fur growth. This is a super easy, quick and effective way to add fur detail fast without having to spend hours painting in individual hairs. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to do before calling this painting finished was to darken up the wooden shelf here. For this I use colours left over on my palette, and I really like to do this as it helps the piece look cohesive. So I used the lunar blue and the neutral tint that I'd used in the background and in the cub's eyes, nose and fur, as well as the olive green yellow and yellow grey that I'd also used in the fur. And I'm quite pleased with how it turned out, but let me know in the comments what you think. Please give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, share and subscribe, and if you'd like to be notified as soon as I upload a new video, be sure to hit the bell icon below too. Thank you so much for watching, have a great weekend, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!